Alright folks, how are you doing? So now we're going to get into the official chapter 1 of William Wallace Robin Hood Revealed, and this is all about the fall of Berwick. Now before I get started on this chapter, this kind of ties into the four-parter that I did right at the beginning of my channel, the Get Skeptic Rebuked videos. So this is kind of unofficially Get Skeptic Rebuked Part 5. I'm not going to put that in the title, but it's just kind of unofficially. But, in this chapter we find out how King Edward had himself crowned the King of Scots and by what means he took the throne. And if this doesn't give you insights into his character and personality and what kind of a king he was, then I don't know what's going to spell it out for you. I mean, you should really read books like this before you make statements like King Edward was more legitimate over Robert the Bruce. I mean, not only is that stupid, it's downright insulting, But, I'm not here to cure anyone else of their ignorance. I saw a video of Gay Skeptics recently where he was walking down the Royal Mile heckling someone in front of him for wearing a leather jacket. I mean, talk about petty. He was, it's no cool to wear a leather jacket. It's no cool to be 5 foot either. I mean, I'm kind of surprised the guy didn't turn around and thump him one. He would have been well within his rights because it was all on camera. Well, no, I don't encourage people to get into fights. I say that tongue in cheek, of course, but, speaking of insights into people's characters, I mean, also he was confusing the Canongate toll booth for the John Knox house, which, to me, for someone who was a tour guide in Edinburgh before the pandemic, like, what? That's a pretty stupid mistake to be making because, for one thing, the John Knox house is way further up. For another thing, the Canongate wasn't even part of Edinburgh when John Knox was alive. And how do you mistake a prison? Tolbooth is a jail. How do you mistake a prison for a private residence? I mean, we're not talking about the best and the brightest here. Let's face it. But, enough about that guy. Let's get into this. So the fall of Berwick, how did it go down? So this is officially page 1. Okay. We read of one right famous and renowned of worthy blood whose name rings loud throughout Scotland. So we're already starting epic. Hence I will now speak of William Wallace, of whom you have all heard. His forebears came from a dynasty and true line of Scotland. Sir Ranald Crawford, the Sheriff of Ayr, had a sweet daughter, Jean, and a noble son, the young Sir Ranald, who later became Sheriff of Ayr after his father. And there's a footnote about Jean Crawford. Possibly her name was Margaret Crawford. That's the more recognised version, but either way, it doesn't really matter. This is Wallace's mother. They were of good fame and renown. This is the Crawfords, I mean. Sir Malcolm Wallace, who held the estates of Ellerslie, Auchenbothy and sundry other places, married Jean Crawford, or * Margaret Crawford. They had 2 sons, Malcolm and William, and some daughters. Unfortunately, we don't hear anything about William Wallace's sisters. They just get dropped out of the story. We only hear that he had sisters, but there's nothing more on them. Their second son, William, was the good Wallace who performed many worthy deeds. Whoever wants more knowledge of this should read the right lines in that book of the First Steward or Conus Chronicle. William was the rescuer of Scotland after it had been lost with treason and falseness. By God's grace, he freed Scotland when it was overcome by foes. After Alexander lost his life at Kinghorn in Fife, this is King Alexander, Scotland remained at peace for 3 years, but it had been devastated by the loss of its worthy king. Because of this state of affairs, a great debate ensued. Our prince, David the Earl of Huntingdon, had 3 famous daughters who became the mothers of 3 lords, Bruce, Balliol and Hasting. 2 of these lords, Bruce and Balliol, desired to become king. Balliol claimed that as his mother was the eldest of the daughters, then he had a rightful claim upon the crown by merit of his relationship in the first degree. Bruce argued that as he was the first male born from these sisters, then his claim to precedence. So we're literally seeing here that Robert the Bruce had a bloodline connection to Scottish royalty. A direct bloodline connection at that, because they're all descended from Prince David, who was himself descended from King David. I believe it was his grandson. It's easy to mix the two up, by the way. I've done that before, mixing up Prince David, who was never the king, with King David, who was his grandfather. But anyway, leaving that to one side. The Estates of Scotland, eager to prevent a civil war, sought the aid of the King of England and the King of France. That's an important point to make. They didn't just go to King Edward, they also went to King Philip. I believe it was King Philip was the King of France at this time. So they were looking for multiple different figures to come in and adjudicate this whole thing, not just King Edward, But anyway, to help resolve this dispute, it was folly that it happened this way to seek succour from their old mortal foe. Edward Longshanks had begun his great war with the French in the lands of Gascony, which he claimed as his heritage. From that time, when he assembled his barons to discuss the situation in Scotland, he had decided that he would conquer our land. It's worth mentioning that King Edward Longshanks was also the Duke of Gascony as well. He wasn't just the King of England and Ireland and Wales, which he conquered. So that whole thing all kind of ties back to the old Angevin Empire and all that sort of thing, but we'll not get into that here. So it continues. This is King Edward. He arranged a meeting to take place at Norham Kirk between himself and the Scottish lords, and then argued subtly that the Scottish kings held their crown by patronage of the kings of England. The Bishop of Glasgow, Robert Wishart, answered for Scotland. We deny anyone to be over the King of Scotland, but God in heaven. Edward was angered and called to his soldiers to arrest the bishop even. Balliol appeased Edward to gain the bishop's safety. Later, contrary to rights, he accepted Longshanks' proposal to confer the crown on him. This act was to cause dire consequences throughout our land. The Scottish lords would not consent to Edward's false claim to be Scotland's overlord. Edward returned to London and called together his parliament. He commanded Balliol to present himself to give homage for the crown of Scotland. The wise lords in Scotland persuaded him to ignore Edward's command, as Balliol had bowed to Edward's claims under duress, and not least from the threat of Edward's military force at Norham. In other words, he was forced to do it. So when you see historians saying that Balliol was a weak king and all this sort of thing, and he just bowed under pressure, well, there is truth to that. But, you have to realize he's being strong-armed into this. It's like mafia tactics, give us what we want or we'll send the boys round. So, did Balliol do the right thing? Well, it's debatable. I mean, it's a very, very tricky, very awkward position that Edward put him in the first place. I can't honestly sit here hand on heart and say that I wouldn't have done the same thing. Well, because I wasn't there. But, Edward was a bully, he was not much better than a Tony Soprano, quite honestly, But let's continue. An abbot was sent to Edward to inform him that the Scottish king would not attend his summons, nor submit to any command of the King of England. So those who are saying that Balliol was cowardly and all this, well, what he just did there took a lot of guts. This rebuke enraged Edward, and so he came with his army to Berwick-Upon-Tweed. Edward had great dread of an encounter at Berwick. He sent for the Earl Corspatrick of Dunbar, asked Corspatrick's advice, and they set upon a plan. Corspatrick, who was respected and trusted by the people of Berwick, rode to the town and gained admission. Edward had encamped with his army out of sight. After midnight, as the town slept, Corspatrick ventured from his lodgings. He knew where the keys to the town gates were kept, took them, let down the bridge, raised the portcullis, then raised his banner atop the castle walls as a signal for Edward, who, with his army, entered Berwick and began an orgy of slaying. As many as 7,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered. No true Scot escaped. Edward left a captain in charge and rode with his army to Dunbar, where Scotland's army was gathered. Once again, Edward prepared for battle. So there you go, there's your great king, Ged, the one that you think should have been the King of Scots, how he took Berwick. Though there are different versions, I've read them in the different books I've got off to the side there. There's a version where Edward just straight out stormed the town without resorting to treachery, but still killed everyone. There's another one where the English dressed up in false colours to trick the Scots into raising the gates. But most of it boils down to treachery, and all of it boils down to a complete massacre. I remember I saw like a documentary years ago where it talked about the slaughter went on for 3 days, and King Edward only called a stop to it after he saw a woman who had just given birth, or was giving birth, being raped right in front of him. So yeah, it really went down at Berwick. And that's Berwick-Upon-Tweed, which is just over the border in England. At that time it was part of Scotland, but nowadays it's part of England. So, getting to the Battle of Dunbar. 4 Scottish earls, Mar, Menteith, Adil and Ross, had entered Dunbar Castle. Corspatrick held them prisoner in the castle, preventing them from returning to the outside to lead their forces. The Scots, without leadership, engaged in battle with Edward and were heavily defeated. Corspatrick, when the fighting was at its cruelest, fought alongside Edward and greatly harmed his fellow countrymen. It's worth noting, by the way, that according to the minstrel, William Wallace was actually present at this battle, but he wasn't the great man yet. He was just another soldier in this battle. He wasn't the leader that he would rise to become. But he was there, and he never forgot it either. There is none in the world does more damage than those who betray the trust of his own people. Corspatrick and Edward rode to Scone, and it was there that Edward had himself crowned King of Scotland, upon the same stone that Gale sent with his son Hyber from Spain to Ireland. From the time of King Malcolm Canmore back to King Fergus, who brought it from Ireland, it had its home at Scone, where kings were crowned 800 years and more before Edward stole it. Now, I just have to kind of asterisk that point. I don't think Edward got the real stone, because the real stone of destiny was described as being black and volcanic. So what you're seeing at, Edinburgh Castle is not the real stone. No one knows where the real stone actually is. But that's just one theory, and I happen to believe it. The precious stone was carried into England and set in London. By the conquest of Scotland, he called himself king. Well, by the very treacherous, dishonest conquest of Scotland, where he's having to lock up the leaders of the Scots army before the battle, where he has to trick his way into Berwick and kills everyone. You're getting a real insight into the kind of guy that King Edward was, Very treacherous, very sneaky, very conniving, cowardly even, I would suggest. Like all bullies are really cowards at heart. King Edward's not any exception. God shall choose the time when St. Margaret's heirs will see amends. 70 of the greatest in the land were taken prisoner, along with their heirs. 70, that means like about 140, I think. Bruce too was taken out of Scotland. Edward gave him his father's estates, both Blattock Muir and Huntington. Huntington, by the way, is down in Cambridgeshire in England. But he decided to hold him in bondage. He gave great lands to Corspatrick for the friendship he had shown him, making him the protector of the whole of Scotland. Corspatrick held this office for a short time. thanks to Wallace. I may not now put all their deeds in rhyme. I could write so much, but will not tarry here. To Wallace once more I will now briefly turn. Scotland was lost and occupied by our enemies before he reached manhood. His father Malcolm had refused to accept Edward of England as Scotland's king, and so took flight to the Lennox, taking with him his eldest son. William and his mother had fled Elderslie, travelling through Gowrie to dwell in Kilspindie. Sir Malcolm had sent them to a wealthy uncle who dwelt there. The old man welcomed them warmly. He sent William to study at the school in Dundee, where William impressed the teachers with his intelligence and application to his studies. Later in war, he achieved great things. Now, if any of you out there are into astrology and things like that, William Wallace was born under the sign of Cancer. Incidentally, so was Robert the Bruce as well. In fact, the actual country of Scotland, the zodiac sign for Scotland is Cancer. Just a little piece of trivia there. And that's also the same with the United States as well, if any of you are into your star signs and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I need a little hydration break there, because my throat can get pretty dry, you know, when you're just talking to me. I think I'll take another little sip. A pause for the cause, as they say. So let's continue with Dundee. William Wallace, before he took up weapons, thought it was a great pity that Scotland was conquered. It greatly depressed his spirit, for he was wise, worthy, valiant, and kind. He still dwelt in Gowrie with the worthy man his uncle. He was heartbroken as he watched the enemy multiply throughout Scotland, and mourned those of his kin who had lost their lives to Englishmen. He grew in stature and intelligence, and was handsome, strong, and bold by the tender age of 18 years. He bore weapons, either a good sword or knife, and he had already confronted the usurpers. He would challenge any lone English soldier whom he encountered. If he found them in numbers, he prudently stayed his hand. Many wished to act likewise, but few dared. Others would speak of no man like him. Sad of face, he was both old and young. He was wise, courteous, and benign, and spoke sparingly. If anyone knows about astrology and all that, one of the traits of those born under Cancer is a very strong sense of patriotism. That's what you're seeing here with Wallace. You know, it's not surprising. The Constable of Dundee was an Englishman called Selby, a cruel man who had oppressed the Scots by his outrageous deeds. He had a son who was near 20 years old. This young Selby was well known to the people of Dundee. He and 3 or 4 of his friends frequented the town most days, making sport, insulting the townspeople, troublemakers intent on mischief. One day, as Wallace walked through the town, young Selby noticed him. He and his friends walked toward Wallace to confront him. William, wearing a bright green cloak, was to be their sport this day. Selby called out for the amusement of the others, "What bold devil is this we see dressed in such fine clothes? An Irish horse blanket is a more fitting garment for your kind to wear. You offend us, strutting around with that large knife hanging under your belt. A small knife for whittling on wood would be more fitting. You shall hand it to me at once." Okay, so this guy's a real prick. "I find it useful for cutting meat," Wallace answered. Boldly, Selby stepped forward to take the weapon. He grabbed hold of Wallace and demanded his knife. Not a smart thing to do. Can you guess how this is going to go? Wallace lost his temper and reacted. He caught Selby by the collar, drew his knife and plunged it into the braggart. His tormentor died where he fell. Selby's friends lunged towards Wallace, but with the bloody knife still in his hand, he spared none that opposed him. Soldiers came running, and Wallace quickly made his escape, fleeing toward a house where his uncle had once lodged. Seeing the woman of the house in the passageway of the building, he called to her, "For the sake of him who died on the cross, help me. I have just killed young Selby." Okay, let's start a little drinking game here. Take a shot every time I read something out and you find yourself thinking, I wish the hell we'd seen that in Braveheart. Because that would have been a great drama action sequence to shoot, but so many things about this account, when you watch Braveheart, you think, what a lost opportunity. Why didn't we get that? So that's a little drinking game we're going to start on this channel. Take a sip of water, or take a swig of beer or wine, or a shot of whiskey every time you find yourself thinking, I wish that was in Braveheart. But let's continue on here. He entered her house, where he fetched a russet gown for him, where she fetched even a russet gown for him to put on, large enough to cover his whole body. Next, a woman's head covering was draped down over his neck and shoulders, and his neck and head even, and she tied a woolen hat upon his head. To fool his pursuers even more, she handed him a distaff and sat him down in a dark corner to spin wool. The English soldiers searched for Wallace, unsure of which house he had entered. They burst into the house in which he sat spinning, but in their haste gave only a quick glance around the room, little realizing that their fugitive was sitting there before them, spinning and humming a tune. Wallace dressed up as a young woman spinning. That's quite the mental image, you have to admit. But yeah, he's in disguise. And probably not a very good disguise. I mean, if they had, really searched and really looked, I think the game would have been up right there and then. It would have been it. It would have been over. But they're in a hurry and they don't know where he is, so they're kind of panicking. And this is, a good lesson here. Never panic and look again, because I don't think Wallace's disguise would have actually stood up to much scrutiny, if they had really looked. But anyway, it's a good thing they didn't. The soldiers left just as quickly as they had entered, and Wallace smiled with great relief. Learning nothing more of his whereabouts. They spitefully harassed many Scots, burning houses throughout the town. She hid Wallace until nightfall, and later stealthily led him from the house. Leading him through a dark enclosure with some trepidation, they edged their way alongside the river bank until they reached the town gates. He took his leave of the brave woman and continued making his escape, evading the English sentries. His mother had remained awake throughout the night, worrying and in great despair, praying for his safe return. When she saw him arrive, she thanked to God for bringing him home safely. His mother was distraught and questioned him. You see what I mean about the grammar in this book? It's really pretty bad at times. She thanked to God. No, she thanked God. Anyway, if ever there was a book that needed an editor. But let's get back to Wallace's reunion with his mother. "Dear son, where have you been till so late an hour?" Hang on, somebody's phoning me. Okay, no one there. That's the second time that's happened today. But anyway, let's get back to this. "Dear son, where have you been till so late an hour?" He told her, this is Wallace's mother, he told her of his situation, and she wept as she gazed upon him. "Alas, alas, if you do not cease, William, you will be caught and slain, as many others have been. Mother, God is the ruler of all, and the English invaders are answerable for their deeds. I believe it is our Christian duty to stand up to them." His uncle, who was also present, listened as he gave details of what had taken place in Dundee. He dreaded the outcome of William's defiance. These fears remained with him for the next few days, and were heightened upon learning that the young men of Dundee were celebrating Wallace's deed in song. It was no longer safe for mother and son to remain with him at Kilspindie. They agreed it would be best if they moved from the district. They planned the best way to make their journey without drawing undue attention to themselves. Both donned pilgrim's clothing, William choosing to conceal a sword beneath his attire. Although they had many friends in the district, they decided to make this journey alone. Travelling on foot, they replied to all inquiries that they were going on a pilgrimage to St. Margaret's shrine at Dunfermline. There's a footnote. Wallace's mother was later buried there. It is said that in pre-Reformation times her grave was marked by what was called the Weeping Cross. In the annals of Dunfermline, we are told, the site was that of the Abbey's Weeping Cross, which at the time of the Reformation was destroyed, and the Gospel Tree of Thorn erected in its place. Okay, so going back to the main story here. This pleased any English person who asked, as St. Margaret had been English born. Footnote: St. Margaret was born in Hungary, although raised at the English royal court. They made the river crossing by the ferry at Lindores, then made their way through the Ochil Hills until they reached their destination. Lodging at Dunfermline for the night, in the morning they joined some English pilgrims who had been to the saint's shrine and who were now returning to Linlithgow. The wife of one pilgrim was besotted with young Wallace, whom she thought very handsome, mannerly, and pleasant. She engaged him in deep conversation, which they both found stimulating and enjoyable. Crossing the river Forth by ferry, the group made straight for Linlithgow. After bidding their travelling companions farewell, William and his mother journeyed on to the village of Dunipace, the Hill of Peace, where they called upon a priest named Wallace. This was William's uncle, who was a man of some wealth. The priest was overjoyed to see them, and saw to it that they were served the very best he had to offer. He gave them news of recent events that had taken place in Scotland. My dear son, you and your mother shall stay with me here until times get better. No, uncle, we shall go further west. Many of our kin and many other worthy people have been slain, and this grieves me. If God spares me, I shall make amends. The parson sighed and said, I cannot think of how you shall do that. I'll hang around and see. What more can I say? Wallace was decided. He would not be swayed from his course, and would no longer bide at Dunipace for gift or good. He and his mother travelled home to Elderslie. And that concludes the first chapter. So, pretty interesting stuff. How Wallace, one of the things about him, he did have a temper, and anyone who put their hands on Wallace, who was English born, that was an automatic death sentence. In, I think, pretty much every single case that I can remember of. Any Englishman who put his hands on Wallace, you're going to be dead in like 10 seconds, buddy. Wallace is not the kind of guy that you want to pick a fight with or provoke in any way whatsoever. But, this braggart Selby, and he's going around bullying people, and the people of Dundee are all oppressed and annoyed and pissed off, and well, along came a man called Wallace and killed the tyrant's son and his bullies, his cohorts, killed them all. Just, you don't put your hands on Wallace, not unless you're asking for death, But Wallace was very, very stubborn. We're going to find this as we go through the chapters. Wallace will not be calmed down. He will not be assuaged. He will not be persuaded to, just take the king's peace or take any sort of bribery or gold or any offers of peace. Totally wasting their time. Wallace is an idealist, and you could almost argue, excessively ideal. He's very single-minded in his goal to free Scotland, and he's not going to stop for anything. You can offer them the world, and what is it? James Bond said, one of my favourite of the Bond movies, where she says, I could have given you the world, and he says, the world is not enough. Those words could apply to William Wallace, in a sense as well. Anyway, hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.